Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we're diving into a tense moment between James, Diep, and Mr. Hoan inside a humble bamboo house where love meets pride and one visit turns into a quiet, emotional battle. Mr. Hoan arrives with cold certainty, judging Diep's life and trying to push James back into the world he belongs to. But James doesn't flinch. He stands between them, refusing to let anyone shame Diep or decide his future for him. If you enjoy emotional, cinematic stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. "If you keep him," Mr. Hoan whispered, his voice soft enough to sound polite, "you will be the reason he loses everything." Diep felt the sentence land inside her ribs, heavy, precise, meant to bruise without leaving a mark. James's shoulder tensed beside her, the kind of tension that comes before a storm breaks. The bamboo house suddenly felt too small for 3 people. A moment earlier, midday light had been slipping through the woven walls, painting pale stripes across the packed earth floor. The kettle had been hissing on the clay stove. Outside, banana leaves had been brushing each other lazily, as if the countryside didn't know how cruel city words could be. Diep had been rinsing a bowl, wiping the table, doing quiet chores to keep her hands from trembling. James had been near the doorway, sleeves rolled up, tightening a loose bamboo tie on the window frame, trying to fix something simple because nothing else felt simple anymore. Then the footsteps came, not the soft barefoot rhythm of villagers, not sandals, leather soles on gravel, heavy, deliberate, wrong. James froze mid-knot. Diep's fingers paused over the tablecloth. A shadow filled the doorway. A man stood there in a crisp shirt, hair neatly set, posture straight like he'd brought an invisible boardroom with him. His eyes swept the bamboo walls, the simple furniture, the kitchen corner like he was inspecting damage. "Mr. Hoan." "Dad," James said, the word careful, restrained. Mr. Hoan didn't answer the greeting. He looked at James as if he'd found a CEO hiding in a shed. Then his gaze shifted to Diep. "You're Diep." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict wearing a name. Diep lowered her chin, folding her hands in front of her. "Yes, sir." Mr. Hoan exhaled almost a laugh, except there was no warmth in it. "So this is where you've been," he said to James, "living like this." James stepped forward without thinking, placing himself between his father and Diep. Not aggressive, protective, instinctive. "Dad, you shouldn't be here." "I shouldn't be here." Mr. Hoan's calm voice made the words sharper. "You disappear. You cut ties. And you think I won't come?" "This isn't about the company," James said. "This is my life." Mr. Hoan's eyes narrowed, finding a softer target. "You know who he is, don't you?" he asked Diep. "I do." "And you still let him stay here," Mr. Hoan said, the contempt slipping through. "Or did you invite him?" James snapped, fast and controlled. "Stop! Don't talk to her like that." Mr. Hoan's mouth tightened. Then, as if choosing a weapon he knew would hit hardest, he looked at Diep again. "A single mother," he said, like the phrase was something dirty. No father, no mother, no background, no family name. Diep's nails pressed into her palm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She held herself together the way cracked porcelain does, still upright, even when it's one touch away from breaking. "My family has status," Mr. Hoan continued. "Reputation, education." He gestured at the bamboo walls without touching them, like they might contaminate him. "And you think you can build a future here?" "Enough," James said, his voice cutting through the kettle's hiss. Mr. Hoan turned to him like a judge delivering a sentence. "You're coming home." "No," James answered. Mr. Hoan's calm finally cracked. "Yes." James didn't shout. He didn't need to. "No." Mr. Hoan pointed at the floor, the house, the invisible line he believed he owned. "If you stay here," he said, "don't step back into my house again." Diep's throat tightened. The bamboo walls seemed to shrink. "I am your father," Mr. Hoan said. "I decide what is acceptable. I will decide what future you have." James laughed once short, bitter. "I'm 28. And," Mr. Hoan scoffed, "and I'm not a child," James said, fierce now. "I take responsibility for my choices." Mr. Hoan glanced at Diep, like she was the proof of James's failure. "Is this your responsibility? Is this what you call a choice worthy of you?" James's jaw flexed. "Don't reduce her to something unworthy." "Then tell me what she is," Mr. Hoan challenged. James didn't hesitate. "She's the person who stood in front of me when trouble came. She's the person who didn't run when I had nothing but problems. You're insulting her because it's easier than admitting you can't control me." That word control hit like a slap. Mr. Hoan went still. James's voice dropped, sharper with honesty. "Grandpa tried to decide your life. You hated it." He swallowed, eyes locked on his father. "So why are you doing the same thing to me?" Silence thudded into the room. Mr. Hoan stepped closer, not to James, but toward Diep. His eyes turned colder, more certain, like he'd found the one crack he could widen. "You think love is enough?" he asked Diep softly. "You think you can keep him here, away from his world?" Diep's lips parted, but no sound came. Mr. Hoan leaned in just a fraction, and that was when he whispered the line that could make her let go with her own hands. "If you keep him, you will be the reason he loses everything." "Dad?" James cut in, but Mr. Hoan didn't look at him. James moved fully between them, shaking with controlled fury. "Look at me," he demanded. "Say it to me." Mr. Hoan straightened, voice turning to steel. "Fine. If you choose her, you choose exile." James didn't blink. The bamboo house held its breath. "Then," James said, each word steady and final, "I choose it." And Mr. Hoan's eyes flicked past James straight to Diep, quiet, sharp, warning her without a single shout. For a heartbeat, Mr. Hoan didn't move. The kettle hissed louder, as if the bamboo house itself was protesting the silence. Sunlight slid across the floor in thin lines, bright enough to show every speck of dust hanging in the air, tiny witnesses to a private war. "Mr." Hoan's jaw worked once, the way a man swallows anger when he's used to winning. Then his eyes shifted not to James, but past him, toward Diep. It was subtle, calculated. Diep felt it like a cold finger under her chin, forcing her to look up without touching her. "You hear that?" Mr. Hoan said, voice calm again. "He's choosing exile like it's romantic." James's shoulders squared. "Don't." Mr. Hoan lifted one hand, not to stop James, but to dismiss him. "Let me speak to her." His gaze stayed on Diep. "Because she's the only one here who still understands the consequences." Diep's throat tightened. She tried to hold her face steady, but her heartbeat was too loud in her ears. Mr. Hoan took a slow step forward, stopping just short of the cooking area, as if he refused to cross fully into their life. "Diep," he said, almost gentle, "if you really care about him, you'll let him go." James's voice turned sharp. "That's manipulation." Mr. Hoan didn't blink. "That's reality." He looked around again at the bamboo walls, the patched table, the kettle, the smallness of everything, and his mouth tightened with contempt. He didn't bother hiding. "My son has a name," he said, "a future, people watching him, waiting for him to fall." Then, like a knife slid slowly under skin, he added, "And you're the easiest way to make him fall." Diep's lips parted. No words came out, because the worst part was her fear of understanding what he meant. Mr. Hoan noticed the hesitation, and his expression sharpened in triumph. He leaned slightly, speaking softer, so every word would feel like a secret Diep had to keep alone. "You don't have to hate him," he said. "Just be smart." Diep's eyes burned. She fought to keep them dry. James saw it the moment her strength started bending instead of standing. "Diep," he said, urgent now, but careful, like his voice could either save her or shatter her. "Don't do that. Don't take his shame and wear it." Diep swallowed. "James, Mr. Hoan cut in instantly, pouncing on the crack. "Look at her," he told James, almost satisfied. "Even she knows this can't last." James turned fully toward his father, eyes blazing. "She knows what it feels like to be blamed for things she didn't do." Mr. Hoan scoffed. "Love makes people say brave lines." James's voice dropped, steady and dangerous. "No. Fear makes people say cruel things." The air went still. Then James took one step closer, not threatening, not reckless, just immovable. "You came here to break her," James said, each word controlled. "Because you think if she collapses, I'll crawl back to you." Mr. Hoan's eyes narrowed. "You think you can fight me?" James didn't hesitate. "If I have to." Another silence, heavier than the first. Not empty. Warning filled. Mr. Hoan straightened, smoothing his cuff as if he were closing a deal. "Fine," he said, voice chilly and clean. "I've seen enough." He turned toward the doorway. James didn't move aside. "If you walk out like this," he said, "don't come back to threaten her again." Mr. Hoan paused at the threshold, head turning just enough to speak without fully facing them. "I didn't threaten her," he replied calmly. "I told her the truth." Then he glanced back once, eyes landing on Diep with final pressure, quiet and sharp. "You seem like an intelligent woman," he said. "Make the intelligent choice." And he left. Footsteps faded down the path, swallowed by wind and banana leaves. The countryside resumed its ordinary sounds, birds, rustling green, distant movement like nothing had happened. Inside, the bamboo house felt painfully quiet. Diep stood frozen, face pale, chest tight like she couldn't pull in enough air. A tear slipped down before she could stop it. James turned to her immediately, anger dissolving into pure concern. "Hey," he said softly, "look at me." Diep blinked, shaking. He's right about one thing." James's stomach dropped. "What? If you lose everything because of me?" James stepped closer, careful, like any sudden motion might break what Mr. Hoan had just tried to crack. He took her hands, holding them steady, warm against her cold fingers. "Diep," he said, firm, "listen to me." His eyes locked on hers. "I'm not losing everything. I'm choosing what matters." Diep's voice trembled. "He knows how to hurt people without touching them." "I know," James admitted, swallowing hard. A beat passed, then his expression shifted again, darker with clarity. "He came alone," James murmured, staring toward the doorway, as if he could still feel his father's presence. "Not because he's weak, because he wanted you to doubt yourself." Diep's breath broke. "And I almost did." James squeezed her hands gently, then released them, standing straighter. "Then we won't let him do it again," he said. "How?" Diep whispered. James looked out at the bright path, the wind stirring the leaves like restless thoughts. "We set rules," he said. "We protect each other." He turned back to her, gaze steady. "And we stop hiding." Diep stared at him, fear and hope colliding in her eyes. The bamboo walls rattled softly in the wind, like the house bracing for what comes next. James lifted his chin, voice low and unshaking. "Let him bring his war," he said. "I'm done running."
Cha của James, ông Hoan, xông vào căn nhà tre và đối xử với Diệp một cách khinh miệt công khai, gọi cô là người không xứng đáng và đổ lỗi cho cô về sự sa ngã của James. Ông đã yêu cầu James trở về nhà và đe dọa cắt đứt mối quan hệ nếu anh ta trở lại. James từ chối, tuyên bố rằng anh ta đã 28 tuổi, sẽ là sự lựa chọn cuộc sống của mình. Ông Hoan chuyển hướng tấn công sang Diệp, thúc giục cô hãy khôn ngoan và để James ra đi, ngụ ý rằng cô sẽ hủy hoại anh ta. Diệp bắt đầu nghi ngờ bản thân dưới áp lực, nhưng James đã can thiệp, vạch trần sự thao túng của cha mình và bảo vệ cô với quyết tâm không lay chuyển. Ông Hoan rời đi sau khi đưa ra lời cảnh báo cuối cùng, nhưng James trấn an Diệp, đặt ra ranh giới, thề rằng anh sẽ ngừng chạy trốn và bảo vệ cuộc sống chung của họ.